Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today we found out why the Trump administration has failed in its diplomacy in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we continue to get further evidence of how they have taken one misstep after another. President Trump had to do on January 20th or the 21st, the day after being inaugurated as the President of the United States, all he had to do was to cut off the intelligence, get the CIA out of Ukraine, stop the money flowing, stop the weapons flowing, stop the intelligence sharing, stop the Pentagon um, from getting money into Ukraine, and then Ukraine their military basically uh, would have lost their revenue stream. They would be no longer able to pay their soldiers and to keep their military infrastructure running financially. The European countries would have followed the United States, and then Ukraine would have gone to the table with Russia and say, "Look, we understand you have a beef with us, and that you have a national security interest that we were, you know, um, that we are a part of. So let's get together and we'll sit down and come up with an agreement and we'll resolve this, and there won't be any problem in the future." But Ukraine was never forced to do that. The United States always uh, continued to send in weapons, money, and money's coming from all over the place. I mean, uh, the IMF basically is the U.S. Is going to loan money to Ukraine. In fact, the money that Ukraine asked for, they were going to give them like 50% more. So the U.S. doesn't have any lack of money to send to Ukraine, and certainly the weapons are going through. Um, and the Trump administration can say whatever they want, but the Ukrainians are still they still have military armored vehicles. They still have bullets. They still have all sorts um, of military equipment and supplies. So we know that all that is flowing in under the direction of the United States, basically running NATO. So, anyway, but the point is that President Trump could have stopped this conflict on day one or day two of his administration, and yet he came up with this story, we're going to freeze the conflict. So, basically, he worked himself into a cul-de-sac, and now he's not able to get out. Um, but no matter what the Trump administration does financially, by sanctions, the Russians have shown that they are in a good situation. And no matter what the United States does at this point, since they've already, carried out most of the sanctions and prohibitions that they could prior to this move, so basically, Russia is saying that it's fine and will be fine, and no matter what the Trump administration does, they'll be fine. So that is the first point, and probably probably a good indication that this was a bad move on the Trump administration, because this will not achieve anything. The second point is that Russians have become self-sufficient ever since the 2014, when the coup took place in Kiev, and that antagonistic government came in. First, the government came in that was handpicked by the U.S. Because we know that this was a U.S.-run coup. So the U.S. put in this government, and ever since then, these governments um, that don't reflect the will of the people have been, antagonistic. These governments have been antagonistic to Russia. So Russia, what they did is something that was very smart. They went through import replacement program, where all these items that they used to be getting from other countries, they began to build facilities and factories on their territory, which produced the same items. So maybe they were getting a lot of refrigerators or washing machines or automobiles or whatever from other countries, and they decide, okay, we're going to build up our own industry, and so we will be more self-sufficient. So Russia is quite insulated from these efforts to sanction its oil companies and to try to take it down financially. This has been all the war hawks and the warmongers that come on Fox News and all these other channels. They say all you have to do is apply a little bit more pressure and Russia is going to collapse like a deck of cards. So anyway, they come up with all these phony narratives and all these pie in the sky ideas, and then the Trump administration buys into it, and so we know from this import replacement program that Russia can continue the war effort as long as it takes. And so nothing that the Trump administration can do by sanctioning companies that have already previously been sanctioned is gonna achieve. So that is point number 2. Point number 3 is that if there was any possibility of dialogue and diplomacy between the Trump administration and the Russians, it was taking place after the meeting in Alaska. There was a short-lived goodwill feeling that came into Moscow, that finally somebody was listening to them and was understanding their national security interest and why they were in Ukraine. But now that President Trump has decided to take this road towards sanctions, he has cut off the possibility of having an honest dialogue and diplomacy. And if you listen to the language of the Trump administration, you'll hear some really offensive expressions. I'll take one from U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He says, Putin's refusal to end this senseless war. Well, it's not senseless for the Russians, and the idea of diplomacy is that you try to understand why it makes sense to them. And so if you're coming to the conclusion that it is senseless, it means that you studied their arguments and you find it senseless. So if you find it senseless, it would behoove you to communicate why you believe that is senseless. But Russia understands that this is a proxy war run by the United States to try to weaken Russia and eventually split Russia up into 3 different chunks so that it could get at its natural resources. And so this was the whole idea of all these NGOs, and there were for a while there were organizations in Russia that were actively working to destroy the Russian state. When they caught on to it, then those organizations, those individuals were expelled from Russia, and so they moved basically one country over into Ukraine, and they continued the belligerent words against Russia, and so President Trump is certainly showing that he's listening more to those people than to the people he needs to listen to, which is President Putin and Lavrov. He doesn't need to repeat verbatim their quote-unquote talking points, but he does need to understand why Do they feel they have a national security interest in Ukraine? And it would seem kind of logical that in the country next to one of the largest and most powerful countries in the world that has access to immense natural resources, Russia would be quite suspicious about the U.S. after U.S. and NATO after the U.S. run coup in Ukraine in 2014, and that hostile governments that came into power afterwards, which were undemocratic and which showed no interest in human rights or in free speech. So, um, so Russia and President Putin had every reason to suspect that this newfound love for Ukraine from the United States and from the Western countries wasn't because they loved Ukraine, it was because they wanted to destroy, weaken, inflict damage on Russia. So if you know that the U.S. has a national security interest in the Philippines, and imagine the distance between the Philippines and the United States. There's a national security interest in Hawaii. That's the reason why the U.S. took over Hawaii, because it wanted to have that buffer. And then they needed to move that buffer out further to the Philippines. And so you're telling me that Russia can't have a national security interest in Ukraine? Only the United States can have a national security interest in Ukraine? So that is really a failure of diplomacy on the part of the United States, something that never would have happened during the Cold War. During the Cold War, at least the people talked and they understood this is their sphere of influence, this is their national security area of interest, and they pretty much respected that. But the U.S., after it became the only hegemon, the empire on the planet, decided that everywhere was its national security interest, even Ukraine. So this failure in diplomacy is a true condemnation of the effort of the Trump administration up until now to resolve this conflict. They could have resolved it a million ways. They could have pulled out funding, the military assistance, the weapons. They could have told their NATO partners not to provide anything to Ukraine, let Ukraine use up its supply, and when it ran out, it would be forced to sit down and have a true, mature, adult discussion with Russia. But they decided, no, we're going to throw more weapons, money at Ukraine. They won't have they won't have enough banks to put all this money. We're just going to keep on sending money and more weapons, and Ukraine will win. That was their idea. Well, it didn't work out the way they wanted it to, and so that brings up my fourth point, which is we're really in the last phase of the war, when the Trump administration took off the mask of being an arbiter and a promoter of peace and presented its true face, which is, playing hardball with Russia and trying to conserve the greatest amount of Ukraine for NATO possible. When they were to see that the Ukrainian army is disintegrating, it's falling apart, the front lines are very thin, they're collapsing slowly, and then this signaled basically the end of the conflict, and so the United States is going to start doing panic measures. And this is a panic measure because it doesn't achieve really anything. So this for me is a very strong indication that we're in this final phase of the war. The United States is pulling from its bag its final cards to play on the table, and these cards are a 2 or a 3 or a 4, while Russia has all the aces and kings and queens. So This was a very bad time for President Trump to decide to take this move. He had built up some goodwill in Alaska, and now we know that that was just fictitious. It was made up, and it wasn't sincere. And so we know that this will that this indicates more than anything the last phase of the war, in which Ukraine begins to collapse, and the United States, instead of trying to be a friend and stay close to Russia and then offer some resolution process, now it's going to treat Russia worse and show that it has no interest. So when the cards are down for Ukraine, it's collapsing. The government is collapsing, and Russia begins to move towards Kiev. The United States really can't complain if Russia doesn't call them up and say, "Hey, we want to figure this out. Why don't you come to Kiev and we'll sit down, we'll figure this out." So it's possible, of course, that Russia could do that, but at this point, why would they do that? The United States has shown that it's not a friend, it's not friendly. It only wants to hurt Russia. But more than anything else, this move shows that this is the last phase of the war. And the last point here is that Trump is totally delusional. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, really. Did President Trump think that the Russians would just drop their weapons and run to Vladivostok and say, "Of course, President Trump, we will stop fighting on the line of contact, even though that doesn't resolve anything and it doesn't achieve any of the goals that we had set out. Of course, we're going to stop because it is you, almighty President Trump, who say that we need to do that and we must obey. We must obey you and bow down." Okay, no, the Russians aren't going to do that. They're not going to do anything stupid. So, you know, the other thing is that Russia's economy is growing, the European economy is shrinking, and the Europeans are in worse and worse state financially. Some of those countries are nearing default. They may be looking at IMF bailouts, which of course the United States will provide because it always has money for these kind of things. Maybe not for the roads or bridges in its own country, but it does have money to throw away in any direction on the planet, as long as it supports their friends when their time of need. So anyway, President Trump is totally delusional about the Russians stopping this conflict on the line of contact. I mean, where is he? Did he consult anyone and say, "Oh, the Russians will accept it"? Or he did say, "I think President Putin will accept it if I ask him." Oh wow, President Putin, he's like your bellhop. You call him up, "Hey, bring me a sandwich. Do it quick." And the bellhop comes up and he brings a sandwich from the kitchen. "Hey, bellhop, I'm thirsty. Bring me a soda." And the bellhop comes running up and he's got the soda. And then, "Hey, bellhop, I got some luggage. Help me bring it down to the reception." And the bellhop grunts up, and gets the luggage and goes down. This seems to be the concept that President Trump has of President Putin, that he's some kind of bellhop sitting in a little office just waiting for President Trump's phone call. "Oh, so good to hear from you. I will do anything for you. You're my best friend." Well, if you need those kind of friends, then you don't need enemies, definitely. But this seems to be the way that President Trump deals with people. But in this case, regarding this conflict, he's totally delusional. I mean, where did he think that the Russians would just drop everything and run for the hills, because President Trump said so, the mighty and powerful President Trump. Okay, so anyway, I think this has been a failure of diplomacy. President Trump has not read the situation very well. Russia is fine. They've, they replaced all the imports. They have their key customers, and their key customers aren't going to abandon them. We even had President Trump say, "Oh, India, they're not going to buy Russian oil anymore. I just talked to Prime Minister Modi," and Prime Minister Modi said, "Who called me? Oh, no one called me." And Prime Minister Modi said, "Oh, well, I spoke to President Trump a week ago, but he didn't talk about oil, Russian oil." At least that's what was reported through the representative of his office. So, President Trump is coming up with all this stuff, and he doesn't know where to start, and he just thinks, if I just ask them nicely and gently, they will just stop fighting, because this war is senseless. Well, this war is not senseless for Russia. This is their national security interest. Basically, Hawaii was a nation that the United States took as one of its states, because it found that this was part of its national security. And you consider the distance from Hawaii to the United States, then think about the Philippines, the distance from the Philippines to the United States, and then you think about Russia and Ukraine right smack together. And if you can't figure out that Russia has a national security interest in Ukraine, then you need to get your money back from whatever course you took on world affairs and diplomacy. But basically, we knew that things were heading in this direction because the United States wants to keep as much of Ukraine as possible, so that it can set up NATO in Ukraine with whatever's left. And Russia's starting to understand this a little bit better as well. And these moves are not helping things. So anyway, I think this was a very bad move on the part of President Trump. And I don't see this as helping things to get any better, nor is this going to force President Putin to come to the table. So anyway, that is my video for today with the 5 points about this sanctions announcement. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have a comment, please leave below in the comment section. If you'd like to give a like or subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for joining Rowell Report, and I wish you the very best. Have a good day. Bye-bye.